My mom died, and my dad's new girlfriend stole his money, but the truth was worse than I ever imagined. Hey Reddit, I'm Tom, 28, and the past year of my life has been a whirlwind of grief, family drama, and betrayal. My mom, Karen, passed away unexpectedly last year, leaving my dad, Roger, 60, completely devastated. Just a few months after she passed, my dad met someone new, Jenna, 45, who seemed to swoop in out of nowhere. I tried to be supportive at first. Everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, but Jenna quickly started showing her true colors. She's manipulative, secretive, and now I've found out she's been stealing money from my dad. But as I dug deeper, I discovered something that left me completely stunned. Here's the full story. It all started about a year ago when my mom, Karen, died suddenly of a heart attack. She was only 58, and it caught everyone by surprise. My parents had been married for 35 years, and they were the definition of a team. Mom was the heart of our family, warm, nurturing, and always there to hold things together. She was the kind of person who would drop everything to help a friend or spend hours on the phone listening to me vent about work or my relationships. Her sudden death shattered our family. I was at work when I got the call from my dad. His voice was frantic, broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Tom, it's your mom, she's gone," he choked out. I could barely process the words. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I rushed to the hospital, but by the time I got there, she was already gone. My dad was in shock, staring blankly at the wall, and I had to keep it together for both of us. The weeks after Mom's death were a blur. We had the funeral, which felt surreal, and then we were left to pick up the pieces. Dad was a mess. He stopped eating, barely slept, and spent most of his days wandering around the house like a ghost. The once lively home filled with the smell of Mom's cooking, her favorite music playing softly in the background, now felt cold and empty. The kitchen, where she'd spent so much time perfecting her recipes, was now untouched, and the garden she'd lovingly tended was starting to wilt. I tried to be there for him, checking in every day, bringing him meals, and helping him sort through Mom's things, but nothing seemed to pull him out of his grief. One night, I found Dad in the living room, surrounded by Mom's old photo albums. He was flipping through them slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of pictures like he was trying to hold on to the memories. He stopped at a photo of their wedding day, his eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know how to do this without her," he whispered, his voice breaking. It was the first time I'd seen my dad, who'd always been a pillar of strength, look so completely lost. A few months after Mom died, I noticed that Dad was starting to come around a bit. He was getting out of the house more, dressing better, and even seemed to have a little more energy. I assumed it was because he was finally processing his grief, but then he told me he'd met someone. Her name was Jenna, and he'd met her at a grief support group. I was surprised, shocked, actually. It hadn't been that long since Mom's death, and I wasn't sure how to feel about Dad moving on so quickly. "She's been really good to me, Tom," Dad said one afternoon as we sat in his living room. "She listens, understands what I'm going through. I didn't think I'd meet anyone like her." I wanted to be supportive. Dad was lonely, and if Jenna was helping him cope, who was I to judge? But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all happening too fast. I hadn't even met Jenna yet, but the way Dad talked about her felt off. He was infatuated, almost like a teenager with his first crush, and it made me uneasy. Still, I told myself it was just my protective instincts kicking in. After all, Dad was a grown man. He deserved to find happiness, even if it was sooner than I expected. The first time I met Jenna, it was at a casual dinner Dad had thrown together. She was attractive, with long blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a confident smile that felt rehearsed. She wore a lot of jewelry, big statement pieces that clinked when she moved, and her clothes were flashy, like she was always ready to be seen. She was chatty, always the one leading the conversation, and she had a way of making herself the center of attention. Jenna was polite enough, but there was something about her that didn't sit right with me. She asked a lot of questions, but they all seemed superficial, like she was more interested in putting on a show than genuinely getting to know me. I remember sitting across from Jenna that night, watching her closely. She laughed at all of Dad's jokes, even the ones that weren't funny, and kept touching his arm, making little gestures that seemed overly familiar for someone he'd just met. She told stories about her glamorous past, how she used to work in high-end real estate, how she traveled all over the world, and how she'd been to all the best restaurants. Everything she said felt performative, like she was constantly auditioning for the role of Dad's new girlfriend. Jenna seemed to be a good influence on Dad at first. She got him out of the house more, encouraged him to start golfing again, and even convinced him to take a weekend trip to the mountains, something he hadn't done since Mom died. He was smiling more, laughing at her jokes, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe Jenna was just what he needed. But as time went on, little red flags started popping up. Jenna was always around, always inserting herself into every aspect of Dad's life. She moved in with him after only a few months of dating, and I could tell Dad was completely smitten. But Jenna was also quick to push boundaries. She started making decisions about the house, redecorating rooms that still had Mom's touch, and even went as far as suggesting that Dad get rid of some of Mom's old things. It rubbed me the wrong way. Mom's memory was still fresh, and it felt like Jenna was trying to erase her. One afternoon, I stopped by Dad's house to find Jenna alone, rummaging through the drawers in Mom's old desk. When I asked what she was doing, she brushed it off, saying she was just trying to organize things for Dad. It seemed odd, but I didn't push it. I didn't want to start a fight, especially with Dad being so happy for the first time in months. But Jenna's constant need to rearrange and redecorate felt invasive, like she was trying to replace Mom's presence with her own. But Jenna's behavior only grew more suspicious. She was always on her phone, whispering in the corner of the room, and she'd get defensive whenever I asked about her life or her past. I knew little about her beyond the surface. She'd been married once before, no kids, and claimed she was working as a freelance consultant. But every time I asked for details, she'd change the subject or give vague answers that left me more confused. It was like she was hiding something, and every instinct I had told me not to trust her. Then there was the money. Dad started spending a lot more than usual: new clothes, fancy dinners, weekend getaways with Jenna. He bought a new car, one that Jenna had picked out, and started talking about taking her on a cruise. I tried to keep my concerns to myself, but it was hard to ignore the drastic change in his spending habits. Dad was always careful with money, especially after Mom passed, but now it was like he was trying to buy his way into Jenna's approval. A few months into their relationship, things took a turn for the worse. Dad called me one evening, his voice tense and anxious. "Tom, can you come over? I need your help with something." When I arrived, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by a pile of bank statements and bills. He looked more frazzled than I'd ever seen him. "I think there's something wrong with my account," he said, pointing to a line on his statement. "There's all this money missing, and I don't remember making these withdrawals." I glanced over the statements, and my stomach dropped. There were thousands of dollars unaccounted for: withdrawals from ATMs, purchases at luxury stores, and large cash transfers that didn't add up. I asked Dad if he'd given his card or account information to anyone, and he hesitated before admitting that Jenna had access to his accounts. She said she was helping me organize things, paying some bills. Dad mumbled, looking embarrassed. I didn't think much of it. "She's been so good to me, Tom." I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't hide my frustration. "Dad, you've got to be careful. You don't know her that well, and this doesn't look right." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't want to believe it. Jenna had wrapped him around her finger, and the thought of her taking advantage of him was too much for him to process. I suggested we go to the bank together to sort things out, and Dad reluctantly agreed. The bank visit was an eye-opener. As we went through the transactions, it became clear that Jenna had been withdrawing large sums of cash regularly, always just under the limit that would have triggered a fraud alert. She'd been shopping at high-end stores, paying for spa days, and even transferred money to accounts that Dad didn't recognize. When the banker suggested freezing the account and launching an investigation, Dad looked like he was about to break. I remember sitting in that small office, the walls closing in as the reality of Jenna's actions sank in. Dad kept rubbing his temples, his face pale and drawn. He was always so careful with his finances, meticulously balancing his checkbook every month, making sure every penny was accounted for. Now, he was realizing that the woman he'd let into his life had been draining his accounts behind his back. Back at home, Jenna was waiting, and when Dad confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she turned on the waterworks, crying about how she'd just been trying to help and that she'd borrowed the money to pay off some personal debts. She painted herself as the victim, claiming she was embarrassed to ask Dad for help directly and that she'd planned to pay him back. I didn't buy it, but Dad was conflicted. He was angry, but Jenna's tears and apologies seemed to soften him. She promised to pay him back, to be more transparent, and to never let it happen again. Dad reluctantly agreed to give her another chance, and I could see the relief on her face. It was like watching a master manipulator at work. She knew exactly how to play on Dad's emotions, how to make him feel sorry for her instead of holding her accountable. But I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Jenna wasn't just making mistakes, she was deliberately exploiting Dad. I started digging into her background, searching online for anything that might explain her behavior. It didn't take long before I found something that made my blood run cold. Jenna had a criminal record. Several, actually. Charges of fraud, theft, and identity theft, all scattered across different states. She'd been involved in multiple scams, including conning older men out of their money. It was all there, buried beneath layers of different aliases and addresses. I couldn't believe that Dad's new girlfriend was a professional scam artist. I printed everything out, feeling a mix of anger and determination. Jenna wasn't just some woman down on her luck, she was a predator, and she'd zeroed in on Dad at his most vulnerable. I knew I had to act fast before she took anything more from him. Update number 1, confronting Jenna and Dad's denial. Armed with the information, I went straight to Dad's house, ready to confront Jenna and put an end to this nightmare. She was in the kitchen, casually flipping through a magazine when I walked in. I didn't waste any time. "Jenna, I know what you've been doing. I've seen your record." She looked up, her face tightening for a split second before she forced a smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Tom." I laid it all out, the charges, the scams, the men she'd conned before Dad. I told her that I'd seen enough to know she wasn't who she claimed to be, and that she needed to leave before things got any worse. Jenna's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. She didn't deny any of it. Instead, she just stared at me, sizing me up like I was an obstacle she needed to get rid of. "Tom, you don't know anything about me," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "I've made mistakes, but I'm not that person anymore. Your dad loves me, and I love him. You're just trying to tear us apart." Before I could respond, Dad came into the room, looking confused and upset. I tried to explain everything, showing him the printouts of Jenna's record, but he refused to look at them. He didn't want to believe that the woman who'd pulled him out of his grief was capable of such things. "Tom, you need to stop this," Dad said, his voice trembling. "Jenna's been good to me. She's helped me through the hardest time of my life. I know she's made mistakes, but we all have. She deserves a second chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was like Dad was in some kind of trance, completely blind to the reality of who Jenna was. No matter how much evidence I showed him, he wouldn't budge. Jenna played the role of the wounded woman perfectly, clinging to Dad and crying about how she'd never do anything to hurt him. I could see the way she manipulated him, turning every accusation into an attack on her character and twisting his loyalty into something she could control. I left that night, feeling defeated and more worried than ever. Jenna had manipulated Dad into believing she was his savior, and he was too deep in his grief to see the truth. I tried to keep my distance, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Dad would come to his senses on his own. But things only got worse. Jenna's control over Dad tightened. She convinced him to cut off contact with me, claiming that I was trying to control him and didn't respect his choices. My calls went unanswered, and whenever I tried to visit, Jenna would make excuses about Dad being busy or not feeling well. It was like she'd built a wall around him, keeping me out while she continued to drain him dry. I kept tabs on Dad as best as I could, checking in with neighbors and friends who occasionally saw him out and about. They told me that Jenna was still spending his money like water, and that Dad seemed more withdrawn than ever. He'd stopped going to his golf club, rarely saw his old friends, and was now spending all his time with Jenna. It was like she'd isolated him from everyone who cared about him. I knew I had to do something, but I felt powerless. Jenna had woven herself so deeply into Dad's life that getting rid of her seemed impossible. I started researching ways to legally intervene, hoping to find some way to protect Dad from Jenna's schemes. But without his cooperation, there was little I could do. Then one day, out of the blue, I got a call from Dad. He sounded panicked, almost frantic. "Tom, I need you to come over. Now." I raced to his house, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. When I arrived, Dad was sitting in the living room, surrounded by more bank statements and legal papers. Jenna was nowhere to be seen, and the house felt eerily quiet. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked, my heart pounding. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "Jenna's gone, and so is most of my money." Dad explained that he'd confronted Jenna about more missing funds, and she'd stormed out, taking her things and leaving a curt note saying she needed space. But it wasn't just her departure that had shaken him, it was what she'd left behind. In the rush to pack up, Jenna had accidentally left some documents behind, including detailed records of her past scams and a recent plan to drain the last of Dad's savings. It was worse than I'd imagined. Jenna hadn't just been stealing from Dad, she'd been systematically dismantling his entire financial security, preparing to leave him broke and alone once she'd taken everything she could. The records were meticulous, outlining every step of her plan, from charming Dad at the grief support group to gaining access to his accounts. She'd even written notes about how to keep Dad isolated from friends and family, ensuring he'd stay dependent on her. I watched as Dad flipped through the papers, his hands trembling. The realization of what Jenna had done and who she really was finally hit him. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. "I was so stupid, Tom. I let her do this to us." I tried to comfort him, but the weight of what had happened was overwhelming. Dad had been betrayed by someone he'd trusted completely, someone who'd wormed her way into his life at his most vulnerable moment. It wasn't just the money, it was the emotional toll of realizing that the person he'd leaned on for support had been using him all along. We filed a police report, detailing everything Jenna had done. But Jenna had covered her tracks well, using fake identities and burner phones, making it nearly impossible to trace her movements. It became clear that Jenna had done this many times before. She was a seasoned scam artist, always ready to disappear and start over with a new target. Dad was devastated, not just by the financial loss, but by the betrayal of someone he'd trusted so deeply. He felt embarrassed, ashamed, and completely broken. We tried to track down Jenna, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. Every lead went cold, and the police told us that recovering the stolen money would be unlikely. Update number 2, rebuilding and picking up the pieces. The next few months were tough. Dad moved in with me temporarily, unable to stand being in the house that held so many memories of Mom and now, Jenna. Every room felt tainted by Jenna's presence, and the reminders of her betrayal were everywhere. I found Dad one night, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at an old photo of him and Mom. He looked more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I just wanted to feel something again," Dad admitted, his voice cracking. "I was so lost after your mom died. Jenna made me feel alive, like I had a second chance. I didn't want to see what was right in front of me." I hugged him, trying to offer some comfort. "It's not your fault, Dad. She took advantage of you when you were vulnerable. But we're going to get through this together." We spent the next few months focusing on healing emotionally and financially. I helped Dad set up a strict budget, and he started seeing a therapist to work through his grief and the betrayal. We sold the house and downsized to a smaller place that felt less haunted by the past. It wasn't easy, but slowly, I began to see glimpses of the old Dad returning. Dad threw himself into rebuilding his life. He reconnected with his old golf buddies, started volunteering at a local community center, and even picked up some part-time work to keep busy. He made new friends, rediscovered old hobbies, and began to find joy in the little things again, like morning walks with his dog, or tinkering in the garage. I also took time to process my own feelings. I'd been so focused on protecting Dad that I hadn't fully dealt with my own grief over losing Mom and the anger I felt toward Jenna. I started seeing a therapist, too, and found solace in sharing my story with others who'd been through similar experiences. It was a long road, but each day felt like a step toward reclaiming my life. Final update, moving forward in finding closure. Hey Reddit, it's Tom again. It's been over a year since Jenna walked out of our lives, and I wanted to give you all an update. The past year has been one of the most difficult, but also one of the most transformative times of my life. Dad is doing better. He's found a new sense of purpose through volunteering at the community center, helping others who are going through tough times. He's made new friends, reconnected with old ones, and even started golfing again. It's been incredible to see him slowly rebuild his confidence and his life. We've accepted that we may never fully recover the money Jenna stole, but we've also come to terms with the fact that healing isn't just about the financial losses, it's about reclaiming our sense of self and learning to move forward without letting the past define us. As for me, I've learned a lot about the importance of setting boundaries, trusting my instincts, and standing up for the people I love even when it's hard. I've reconnected with my own passions, focusing more on my career and personal growth. I've even started dating again, something I'd put on hold for a long time while I was helping Dad. We've continued to build new routines and find ways to honor Mom's memory. Every year, on her birthday, Dad and I cook one of her favorite meals and sit down to talk about our favorite memories of her. It's a small way of keeping her spirit alive, a reminder of the love that built our family and the strength that keeps us going. To anyone out there dealing with a similar situation, just know that you're not alone. It's okay to be angry, to feel betrayed, and to struggle with the fallout of someone else's actions. But you're stronger than you think, and with time, you can rebuild. Thanks for being part of my journey. Here's to finding strength in the face of adversity, learning from our mistakes, and embracing new beginnings, no matter how unexpected they might be.